Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on the Wellbeing Thesis and looking after postgraduate student well-being and ensuring that looking after well-being and looking after research can benefit each other. My name is Dr. Gareth Hughes. I'm going to be talking for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll be opening up for questions after all of that, and you can post those into the chat on the YouTube channel, and we'll pick those up and feed them back through to you. So just to begin by saying, really, I guess my background and my work is really largely being in student mental health, and I've been working for a number of years now on finding different ways to improve student mental health and well-being in the universities throughout the UK. I was a psychotherapist working in universities for many years, and I've done a number of things, including I was the lead author of the University Mental Health Charter. But one of the big projects that I've worked on was to develop something called the Wellbeing Thesis, which is an online resource, open access, that any student can access and use to help support postgraduate research students to support their well-being and their research as they move through that kind of research journey. So I'm going to be talking about that a little bit later on today, but we did quite a lot of research in putting that together because it was a co-created piece of work. We worked with PhD students in a number of universities to help put that piece of work together, and we did some empirical research to underpin that. And I'm going to be drawing on all of that in the conversation that I have with you today, as well as the research that's in the literature. And we'll talk about those things that particularly influence PGR well-being, postgraduate student researcher well-being, and we'll also be looking at ways in which you might be able to work within those kind of boundaries and restrictions, and ways in which you can actually work to improve your own well-being and improve your research by doing so. So if we can go to the first slide, please, and we'll make a start from there. So there's been quite a bit of research that's been done over the course of the last few years, really kicked off by Claudia Levesque's paper in 2017, beginning to really focus in on postgraduate research students and what's been going on for the mental health and well-being. Up until that point, I guess, more attention had been paid to undergraduate students. But the more we've looked at this, the more it's become clear that there are some specific things going on for research students that we need to be paying more close attention to. And there are some things that we can do both as a sector, but also individually as researchers, to improve our own well-being and to improve the environments that we're researching in. There have been particular concerns raised about the well-being of PhD students, and you don't have to go far on social media or to look very far on PhD student social media accounts to see discussions about the impact that PhD can have on your well-being, negative and positive. And I think there's almost an assumption that arises in some of the literature and amongst some researchers and some academics and some supervisors, I think, that it's inevitable that the PhD will have a negative impact on well-being, that it's almost baked in that if you're going to do a PhD, you should kind of expect poor well-being as part of all of that, or that we should expect research environments to have a negative impact on well-being overall, because that's something that's required in order to produce research excellence. We're going to look at that a little bit today and unpick that and see why that actually isn't true. But it's really important, right, to pin at this very beginning to say that it's also not true of all PhD students, that actually there are many PhD students out there who do manage to work in a way which looks after their well-being and still manage to produce good research and manage to get their PhD. And that we need to be very careful about this idea that it's inevitable that you have to sacrifice your well-being in order to get a PhD, because it simply isn't true. And in some of the research we've done, actually, in some of the populations, the majority of PhD students were able to look after their well-being and to maintain good well-being throughout the course of their PhD. So we've got to be careful that that's not a narrative that we're taking on board and assuming that it's inevitable and therefore it's something that we have to put up with. It absolutely isn't. And we'll talk about why that is as we move through the session today. If we go to the next slide, please. If we can go to the next slide. Thank you very much. So, if we can just go back one, sorry. We interviewed a range of students for this. So we had two large focus groups of students in two different types of universities, one in a post-92 university and one in a research-intensive Russell Group university. And they were a diverse group. We deliberately recruited a diverse group of students, so some international students, some mature students, some who were fresh out of undergraduate. And they were at different stages of their PhD journey as well. Some were in their first year, some second, some third year. And we interviewed them in quite a lot of depth, and we did quite a lot of work to kind of co-create the Wellbeing Thesis, but also to really understand their experiences. We did 4 sessions with each group, so there were 8 sessions overall, and they lasted several hours in length, each one of those. And we were really digging into the experience of being a PhD student at a university and what that's like right now. We backed that up with some national surveys of PhD students to kind of make sure that what we were uncovering in those focus groups actually was replicated, and it was. And when we've kind of presented this work throughout universities elsewhere in the UK, that's kind of come through very strongly, that actually that this does very much sound like the experience of a lot of PhD students. And then obviously the whole thing was underpinned by a very thorough literature review. And so we built the whole thing, the Wellbeing thesis itself is built very much on grounded evidence in the experiences of PhD students in both quantitative and qualitative research. So we're really sure that what we found and what we discovered actually is genuinely a true reflection of the picture that's out there for the majority. I mean, it's never a reflection for everybody, but for the majority of PhD students within the UK. If I can have the next slide then, please. So basically, there were three things that came back from the students that we talked to, and we're going to break down and look at these three areas in the session today, and look at ways in which that can potentially have positive or negative impacts on well-being, but also what individual students can do within those three areas to actually boost their well-being and their research overall. So the three areas generally were about university culture and environment. So the researcher environment, but also that broader university community environment. What it was that PhD students found was surrounding them, what the narratives were, what the relationships were like, what the expectations were, what that kind of environment that created around them and the impact that had. Then there were the thoughts and behaviors and the personal experience of the students themselves. So the actions that students took, how they thought about themselves and what they were doing on their PhD. And then there were the outside events as well, because one of the things that we heard about was, one of the students put this, I think, very well, was they said that they and many of their friends had come into their PhD with the assumption that what they were going to do was put their life on hold for 3 years while they did their PhD. So I'll just park my life, I'll get my PhD, and then I'll go back to it. But of course, life can't be parked. Life continues and things continue to happen during that space of time, and they have to be managed alongside the PhD. And if you still work with that expectation that actually that then means it's interfering with your PhD and that's not how you wanted this to go, and that it's going to create a problem for you actually finishing, then that can cause a problem in and of itself that gets in the way of you being able to actually focus when you have got the time, and you can go on those kind of negative thought spirals that might actually get in the way. So those expectations are a crucial part of this, but also having the time and the space to be able to manage those things when they do intrude on your life is a really important part of this whole process. So let's unpick this and let's start thinking about, well, actually, how do these three things work? How do they impact on mental health and well-being overall? And what can we do within all of that to boost well-being and to boost research overall? So if we can go on to the next slide, please. So one of the things that we know from the research, there are many theories about mental health, and there are many theories about well-being, and also many ideas about what well-being is and what it looks like. And any of you who are in the kind of psychology world will know that there are different models of well-being and different ways of questioning and thinking about it. But if we look at those bigger, broader ideas about good mental health and good well-being, and we look about where does that arise, what gives rise to that, or conversely, what gives rise to poor mental health or poor well-being, what we can see is that it very largely arises from what we're doing on a day-to-day basis, where we live, who's around us, the social connections that we have, and the way that we think about ourselves. So in other words, really the way in which we're able to meet our needs and the environment that we're in on a day-to-day basis has a very large impact on our well-being overall. So the kind of theories that would have been around for a very long time were that your mental health and well-being was always related to your past, and whilst some of that is still true, we understand much more now that actually it's what's going on in your day-to-day, what's happening in your present life, that really creates your well-being overall. So that can be all kinds of things. That might be everything from your accommodation, and there's some really interesting research that's been published recently on how the quality of housing can impact on your well-being overall, or the impact on finance, for instance, the impact on the money that you have available to you. And some of our students talk very much about, managing on a stipend, or for those students who weren't who weren't funded, who are having to find their own funding and work alongside that, what that could do. The quality of the social relationship that you have, we're going to talk about that specifically in a little moment, and the kind of narratives that exist all around all of that. So basically, we need to think about the way our environment works for us physically, what it cues us to do physically, because we know that the environment can make some things easier or more difficult. We know, for instance, that we are very cued by the environment into physical health behaviors. So what you reach for to eat is very physically cued by what's immediately available around you. Whether or not you go and get exercise is about how easy that is to go and engage in that kind of exercise. Whether you go out and get sunlight is about whether that's a thing that other people in your environment do. We see this in workplace studies where if nobody else takes a break, then you feel you can't take a break. But if everybody else takes a break for lunch, then you take a break for lunch as well. If everybody else has breaks outside regularly, then it's something that you do because the environment allows it and creates the space for it to happen. So this can impact in a number of ways. And if we can go to the next slide, please, we'll look at one specific way in which this works. And we'll look at the way in which social connection particularly can have an impact on our well-being overall. So this is based on the work of someone called John Cacioppo. John Cacioppo was a social neuroscientist. So he studied the effect of social connection and lack of social connection on the brain and the way that it impacted on brain function. And one of the things that he uncovered was that when someone perceives themselves to be lonely, and that's the key, but when someone thinks that they're lonely, there are a number of things that happen very quickly as a result of all of that. So the first thing is that we stop being able to think as clearly. Our cognitive functioning drops. So you start to feel lonely, and immediately your ability to think clearly starts to drop. Your mood will drop as well alongside all of that. So you'll start to feel low. You'll not be thinking as clearly. And then that impacts on academic performance. You'll be less able to problem solve. You'll be less able to think creatively. You'll have less access to your memory. It'll be more difficult to remember things. And as a result of that, academic performance and research performance will drop overall. Another really interesting thing that happens, though, and this is one of the things that fascinates me, is that the other thing that happens when we start to think that feel that we're lonely is that actually it impacts on our physical self as well. So our immune system, for instance, stops functioning as well. If you take two groups of people, one group of people who are lonely, one group of people who are not, and you give them both the common cold virus, the group who are lonely are much more likely to actually get the cold and to become ill. So what we can see from all of that, and there are a number of ways in which this actually works, but what that means is that the way in which we perceive ourselves and the way our mood is functioning can have an immediate impact overall on our physical self and how physically well we are, as well as impacting on our academic performance. And that's a really important thing to think about, because one of the things that we try to do very often as students is we try to compartmentalize our life. We try to say, well, I can ignore the need for a healthy diet. I can put to one side the fact that I haven't had time to spend with my friends for ages because I need to focus on my academic work. I need to get my research done. I've got an experiment running. I need to get this bit written. I need to do the research review, the literature review. But actually, by ignoring all of those other things, by not spending time with other people, not having some fun, not having some time off to relax, not looking after our physical selves, you're going to be reducing your academic performance and your ability to do good research. Because we, as human beings, we can't separate these things out into separate processes. They are interlocked and interlinked. And that's one of the really, I think, key things to take away from this session today, which is that human beings don't function like machines or like factories. You can't prescribe different functions to different parts of yourself and separate it off from everything else, because it doesn't work. And what was really interesting in the research that we did when we were talking to students about this was that actually quite a number of students had come to this realization for themselves during the course of their PhD. Many of them had begun by working really long hours, by sacrificing sleep, by trying to devote their whole selves to their PhD, not having time off, not seeing friends, not eating healthily. And then very quickly, halfway into their first year at most, starting to realize this just wasn't going to work. They weren't going to last 3 years working like that. And then starting to go to the gym and take breaks and get regular sleep, and suddenly realizing that actually that led to better ideas, better problem solving, better research, better writing. And as a result of all that, making that connection that actually I do better work and I'm more productive if I actually look after those other parts of myself. And everything that we know about performance, all the studies on human performance, all the studies on human health, all the studies we have on cognitive functioning, all of those things basically support that basic thesis, which is that if you really want to be productive, if you really want to do good research, if you want to have really good ideas and problem solve and generate new thoughts and do new good research, you have to also look after those other parts of yourself. You have to also be looking after well-being, because otherwise your ability to do that research will erode. Now, it doesn't mean you have to do it perfectly. None of us ever get that right. It doesn't mean you have to have some kind of perfect balance in order to produce great research. But it does mean you need to be paying attention to it and you need to be thinking about it. Now, there are, however, unfortunately, some things that can get in the way of that. And there are some things in the research culture that can get in the way of it. But if we're aware of it and we're aware that they're wrong, then it empowers us to actually take action, to move past those things, to move past those barriers, and to actually do the things that are going to look after us. So let's look at what some of the things that came out of the research within the culture and environment that could get in the way. So if I could have the next slide, please, and we'll look at what some of those things are. So we'll start from the beginning. We'll pick up from where we were on the last slide, thinking about social connection. And one of the things that came out really strongly was that sense of a need for belonging and a need for community, which for PhD students, we know can be more challenging. And it can be challenging for a number of reasons. It can be just that actually there are assumptions made that PhD students don't need as much support, which doesn't really hold. That PhD students can just find social connections in the same way, when actually the postgraduate community is generally smaller and harder to necessarily connect with. And what became very clear from our research is that actually, as a postgraduate research student, what you really need to do is be really structured and deliberate in the way in which you go about building your social network within the university, because it won't happen by osmosis as it does for many undergraduate students, who will just bump into people and make friends with them and then find a friendship group that way. That actually, as a PhD student, you have to think about it. You have to treat it as a problem that's there to be solved. You have to build a plan. You have to identify those areas within the university where you may meet other people who have similar interests and similar characteristics to you, and then deliberately go and put yourself in those positions and meet a number of people in a number of groups in a number of places. And that out of that, you will eventually develop a friendship group. And those students who do that find that works for them. Whereas if you wait for it and hope for it, then you may end up feeling more isolated. You may end up not feeling as connected. Now, some people are lucky. Some people are in research labs where there's a great sense of community, and then you're able to plug into that very quickly and work through that. But some aren't. But universities are big places. There are many people in there, and there is usually an opportunity to meet people who you will like and will get on with and can build friendships with. But you may just have to sit down and build a plan and act on that and put that into place in order to build your community and to build that sense of belonging. One of the other things that came out from the research is that sometimes what PhD students encounter is that actually they don't yet have the skills to do the level of research and the level of writing that is required of a PhD student, but that there are kind of assumptions that because they're now a PhD student, those skills will automatically exist. And so there's this kind of expectation gap between what you may be the skills you may actually have and what your supervisor and the academics in your department may assume you have. And that's unfair, and that's not okay, and that's something that universities are trying to address and think about much more. But if it is something that you feel, then it is important to talk to your supervisor about that, but also to use the other resources that are going to be around within your university, because there will be people within the library, within study skills teams, and within your research college or centre who will be able to help you actually learn those skills. Because it's important to remember that if you could sit down, write up your PhD report immediately, do that quality of research right away, then actually there'd be no need for your study to take 3 years. The reason PhDs take so long to do is because there is a period of time necessary for you to build up your skill and build up your learning. And those of us who've been doing research a bit longer will tell you, you don't stop that learning. You're always constantly developing your understanding, the nuance, the skill that you have, the experience that you have to become a better and better and better researcher. So there's no reason why you should expect yourself to be an expert researcher the day that you start. And if you don't know how to do something, or you don't know something about your subject, that's perfectly okay. That's the learning that we do. None of us can know everything about our subject. So accepting that and then taking the action that you need to build up that knowledge and skill, and recognizing that it doesn't mean you're not capable. It doesn't mean you're not good enough. It just means you've not learned it yet, but you're there to learn, and that's okay. The third thing is a feeling from some students, depending on where you are, that there is a constant pressure and an expectation that you should be publishing almost immediately, that you're in a competitive market, and that you've got to be demonstrating straight away. And that really depends on your research project. Some people will be able to start publishing very quickly, but some research projects just don't have anything worth publishing until the very end, when there then might be quite a lot to publish. And so again, not allowing your research to be pushed into a box and to think that you should be producing something when that's just not the way your project's going to work. There will be opportunities for you to publish along the way. It may be at the end, it may be during the course of your PhD, but actually, sit down, talk to your supervisor, work that out, understand your own project, and don't feel that you've got to be fitting into a template, a publication template that other people are pursuing. Lack of guidance, again, referring back to assumptions about capabilities, but lack of guidance was another one of those things that students talked to us about, and feeling that, if they're not getting the guidance that they feel they need from their supervisor. And it's important to remember that that relationship is key and is also totally different to any relationship you will have had before. And actually, there is a real onus and a need as a PGR student, as a research student, to actually take ownership of that relationship. And as much as possible to be dictating it and to be going to your supervisor and saying, this is what I need, this is when I need it. And also, but negotiating and being realistic about what that's likely to be, because your supervisor is likely to also be a really busy academic. So giving them good warning in advance and saying, I'm going to be producing a piece of work in 3 weeks' time. I would like some feedback on that piece of work. I will send it to you on this date, because then your academic can start blocking it out. And then the final thing, and this was the thing I really want to dig into today, were unhelpful myths, because the research community and environment has a number of myths about how research gets produced and how PhDs get produced that are actually a barrier to good research being done. And are also a barrier to the well-being and mental health of postgraduate research students. So let's have a look at how that might work. If I can have the next slide, please. So why am I talking about myths, and why are they important? Well, they're important because actually human beings are storytelling creatures. We absorb narrative constantly. The way we understand the world is by creating stories about how the world works and about who we are. Because the world is really big and really complicated and way more confusing than we could possibly understand in total. And there's an awful lot going on all at once, and we need to be able to filter it out in order to be able to focus and concentrate. And so in order to be able to move through the world and function within it, we create narratives. And all of our communication is essentially a form of narrative. This is one of the things Fisher talked about, the narrative paradigm. Everything that we do, everything that we speak, all the stories that we tell, even the research that we write, is essentially telling a story. And what we know from research on kind of developing brains in children and adolescents is that our brains are wired and shaped by the stories that we hear. So the networks that get created in our brain, and actually even the very shape of our brain itself, are molded and affected by the stories that we hear in childhood. And actually, in some ways, story is the most important thing that we have as human beings. It's one of the key things that marks us out as different from other animals. If you think about the things that we eat, there are many things that we could eat that would be perfectly healthy for the human body to eat that we don't. And we don't because we have stories that tell us that it's wrong to eat those things. Vegetarians will have stories about meat. If you're religious, there may be certain things you don't eat as a result of that. But even within different cultures, within the UK, it's frowned on to eat horse or to eat dog, for instance, because we have a cultural story that those things are wrong. So our stories influence us. And if you're in an environment where there is a story that's constantly driving you and telling you, you should be behaving like this is what you should be doing, this is how you should be, it's very difficult to resist that unless you're aware that that's what's happening. And then you can fall into behaviors that actually aren't good for you, simply because those are the expectations that are around us. If I can have the next slide, please. So we're primed then to adapt to those cultural narratives, and those can have really positive social benefits. If you think about this, that actually one of the things that holds us together as a society is when we have a common story, when we have a sense of common purpose. That kind of holds us together and means we all feel like we're working in one direction. Really good functioning teams in workplaces, for instance, or in sport, and function together when they have a shared sense of purpose. So that could be really useful. However, they can also have that negative effect, what we would call a nocebo effect, which is the opposite of placebo. It's a nocebo effect, which creates an expectation that our well-being is going to be poor, and then inevitably leads to that. So if I can have the next slide, please, which illustrates this quite well. So this is a little comic. Some of you might see PhD comics, which I quite like. And I think this little cartoon illustrates itself quite nicely. But I do come across many PhD students, and this came up a lot in our research, this expectation that either you can get your PhD or you can have a balanced lifestyle and look after your well-being. And it's a choice. It's one or the other. And there's no way to actually do both. And so let's just unpick that and drive behind that to see what are the myths that actually sit behind that. And then we'll have a look at why those things aren't necessarily true. So if I can have my next slide, please. Thank you. So the first myth, and these were myths that we talked to students about, and they helped us kind of identify what they were and put this together, is the first one is that it's inevitable that PGR students or PhD students become very stressed and become mentally ill. Again, we know from the data and the research, actually this isn't true, but it is one that you hear a lot, that it is inevitable that you become mentally. It's an extraordinary thing. You think about that, why would you go and do something that is inevitably going to make you ill? And if that is true and was true, then it would be something we ought to change, really. And actually, what we know is that when we become stressed, the part of our brain that we use for that more complex work, so the prefrontal cortex, actually, the more stressed you become, the more that gets shut down. So the part of your brain that you use for complex thoughts, for problem solving, for creativity, gets shut down the more stressed you become. So you end up only really being able to think in very simplistic black and white thoughts, or not think at all if you become very, very stressed, which obviously isn't good when you're trying to solve complex problems, which is generally what you're trying to do with a research project or PhD level. So actually, to become mentally unhealthy in that way is not going to benefit your research at all. And so actually taking breaks and stepping away and helping to de-stress, it makes far more sense than to just simply driving yourself home. One of the things that sits alongside this is this idea that PGR students should work very long hours, sacrificing balance. And we're going to come on and talk in a little moment about why that just doesn't work, about why driving yourself in that way just simply does not produce more work or better work. We're also going to look at sleep, and I'm going to just pause and talk about sleep a little bit more, because one of the things that many students talk to us about is sacrificing sleep, giving up sleep to work long hours, to work late into the night, to work into the early hours of the morning, sleeping less overall. Now, there are three things that we do in sleep that are to do with learning. The first thing is we clear away clutter from the previous day from our memory store. So in order for our memory and for our brain not to get clogged up with too much information, there's a kind of flushing process that happens when we're asleep. And things that have happened during the course of the day that aren't important, that we don't need to remember, that gets flushed away. So that the next day we're able to wake up and re-engage with the world and have memory and capacity to take in new things. The second thing that happened is we consolidate our learning when we're asleep, so that when you're asleep, the things that you've learned during the day that are important actually get consolidated into your long-term memory while you're sleeping. The third thing that happens is we have a period of problem solving when we're asleep. So if you set two groups an incredibly difficult maths problem, and then partway through you pause them and take them away from the problem, one group just goes off and does something kind of relaxing but stays awake, the other group goes and has a nice sleep, then you bring both groups back to the problem. The group who have had a nice sleep will solve that problem much more quickly. And there are lots of recorded instances in history of people solving difficult, complex problems after a good night's sleep. So sleep actually is incredibly important to your learning. It's also very incredibly important to your well-being. So for your physical health, it's really important. It also helps to repair muscle tears. It tops up the glial cells with glucose so that you have energy the next day. It does an awful lot, flushes away toxins that can otherwise build up within your body. And it's really important for your mental health. There isn't a single mental health diagnosis, so a single type of mental illness that doesn't have disrupted sleep of some kind within the diagnostic criteria. So good sleep is really important for your mental health, for your physical health, and for your ability to learn and do academic work. So creativity, much more likely to spring forth when you are well rested and when you have slept well. So actually giving up sleep will likely to lead to you producing less research and less good quality research overall. Next slide, please. So let's just look at that thing about long working hours and what we know from that. So this is something that has been studied for a very, very long time indeed. And the findings really are quite straightforward. If you work long hours, your productivity and your creativity decline and then eventually go into reverse. What that means is that there comes a point when the hours that you're working, say if you're getting to around 60 hours a week, you will actually be producing less than if you worked about 40 hours a week. Now, why might this be? Well, if you think about it, what happens as you get more tired is you make more mistakes. You start to go down more blind alleys that you don't recognize early enough that they aren't going to be helpful. You get stuck working on problems. Actually, a lot of that time you won't be doing productive work. You'll just be trying to make yourself work, but you'll be so tired you won't be able to focus. And that just continues to increase your tiredness overall. And then because you make mistakes, there's things you've got to go back and redo and start all over again. And so actually you'd have been better off not doing some of that work in the first place. What we know is that peak creativity and peak problem solving happens in a state that we call flow. Flow is much easier to get to if you are well rested and your well-being is in a good place. It's harder to get to when you are already in a tired state. We also know from research on taking breaks that taking breaks has an enormously positive impact on the brain. And there are an awful lot of neural scans, particularly if you're working on screens. There's a lot of stuff you can see. Sometimes it crops up on social media, the research around this, showing how the brain actually starts to heat up the longer you've been working, and that by going away and taking a break, it allows that to cool down. But the other thing that happens is the brain's backup processor, the kind of unconscious part of your brain, kicks in and also starts to engage with problems and move things out of your working memory into long-term memory when you take breaks. So taking regular breaks actually will build your understanding of the problem that you're working on. You will be more creative and you'll come up with more solutions. And you'll feel fresher and have more energy and more stamina to continue and being able to keep going throughout the course of the whole day if you take regular breaks. So next slide, please. Now, this might seem like something you would expect somebody like me to say. You know, I've got long hair and a beard and, you know, all very woolly and hippie, and I'm a psychotherapist, and so you'd expect me to say things like that. But actually, one of the clearest examples of this is from that well-known hippie called Henry Ford, who in the 1920s started to recognize that actually the productivity in his factory reduced if he allowed people to work over 40 hours a week. So again, as I said, we've known this thing for decades. So that when people are working, particularly in physical jobs or in factory jobs, if they work over 40 hours a week, then their productivity starts to decline overall. They produce less as a result of working longer because they get tired. Those of us who work with our brain, actually there's a bit of research around that suggests it might even be a little bit less than 40 hours a week, maybe 35, 36 hours is kind of peak amount of working time a week to produce, to have you at your most productive and your most creative overall. Now, we can kind of accept that and kind of say, okay, this is what human beings are capable of and this is what we can do and therefore we have to work with that. Or you can say, no, the research environment requires us to do something different. In which case what you're saying is you don't really believe in research and you don't really believe in using evidence because you're going to force yourself to do something which we know human beings can't do. If you have a supervisor who tells you that this is reality and that you have to work long hours and tire yourself out and become mentally ill in order to get your PhD, then point out to them they don't obviously believe in research and evidence, because research and evidence says that's nonsense. Actually taking breaks, getting good sleep, looking after your health and well-being overall is more likely to produce good research and more likely to produce good work towards your PhD over the course of 3 years. Remember, 3 years is a long time to be working on a PhD. You will burn out very quickly if you try to work long hours all of the time. If I can have the next slide, please. But the thing that comes back from this is, yes, but I was in the lab at 3 a.m. and suddenly I had a brilliant idea. Suddenly the solution came to me. And if I hadn't been in the lab at that point, if I hadn't been awake, if I hadn't worked 12 hours straight, I never would have come up with that idea. To which I respond, hello, our old friend, availability bias. Because yes, you're noticing that you came up with your idea at that moment. What you're not noticing is that if you'd been getting good sleep and looking after your well-being, you probably would have got to it much sooner. You might even have got to a better idea, or you might not have got into the problem that you needed a solution to in the first place. And it's really important to remember that people do draw on their experience more than evidence to decide how the world works. Remember, that's what creates our story. And so people have their personal stories about how this worked for me, and therefore that's what you should do as well. But actually, they're not seeing the bit of the story that they're missing. They're not seeing what would have happened, the counterfactual, if they hadn't treated their well-being in that way, and that actually they may have come up with better ideas. And generally in the research, that's what we see happens. If we can go to the next slide then, please. So just a few more of these myths, and we'll go through these a little bit more quickly. The idea that you owe a debt to your supervisor. Your responsibility is to you and to your research. You've been recruited to do a PhD, and that is where your debt is. You don't need to feel indebted to somebody else. Also, this idea that you don't get a lecturing job doing a PhD is pointless. There are many people working throughout the country with PhDs in areas other than academia and other than in academic jobs. I'm a freelancer. I'm a consultant. I don't work within a university in a typical academic role. I have a very good career and that I enjoy very much, and that is really meaningful, and that earns me a good living. So there are many ways in which you can use your PhD other than by just taking an academic job. We've talked about the idea that you should be publishing all of the time, not necessarily being helpful, and also the idea that you should have better results than this by now. The expectation that actually, as soon as you go to research, you should start producing world-shaking results instantly, or clear results, or that proving your hypothesis immediately. It's really important to remember that research is a messy business, that it does not happen in a straight line. You do not produce immediate results. There will always be the, what's that? What? I mean, someone once said to me that actually a demonstration of research, the most common thing you hear in research labs or in research environments is not eureka, but what's that? Because something unexpected has occurred. And if you think about that, within some of the great discoveries, like the discovery of penicillin, that was a research experiment that had gone wrong, that led to the discovery of something that saved millions of lives. So, the results come as they come. And what we have to do as researchers is be able to embrace that messiness and walk into it and be comfortable with it. And I'll talk a little bit more about being uncomfortable and uncertainty in a moment. Next slide, please. So why is it that these myths are around if they're not true? Well, because stories just keep themselves going. Narratives self-sustain. They get passed along. They get passed from generation to generation. It's also important for us to remember that the supervisors that we have at the moment are the survivors of this system. It felt like it worked for them. And people also turn their pain into something meaningful. So they will tell themselves, yes, well, I went through that pain, but that was necessary to get my PhD. Actually accepting that it wasn't necessary can be quite difficult. And so people will stick with their story overall. And of course, our academics are generally quite overworked at the moment. And so being able to engage with the idea that there are different things outside of all of that, are a different way of working, they just might not have this headspace to think about it or engage with it. Largely because many of our academics are also in work cultures that push them into behaviors which are not good overall. But we as individuals and as groups and as communities, we can resist it. We can decide, actually, we're not going to engage with that. So if we can go to our next slide, please. And one of the great things about the research that we did is that students told us about how they did this. That actually what they did was they went along with this culture, but then over time recognized that this wasn't a useful thing. And then they started to resist it. They started to push against all of that. Now, there are difficulties within all of that, and we need to recognize that many students, that the idea of who you are as a PhD student. Are you a student? Are you a member of staff? Are you something in between? And actually, the students who made this work best for them were the ones who were just kind of comfortable going, well, I'm all three at different times, and I decide which hat I wear when, and I make it work for me in that way. But also that thing about, pushing against that imposter syndrome and pushing against the guilt that comes along when, you're relaxing and the voice is saying, you should be working on your PhD. And remembering and being able to tell that voice, I am working on my PhD. When I'm relaxing, I am preparing to go back and work next time. When I spend time with my friends and have fun, I'm discharging the energy, I'm reducing my stress level, I'm clearing my brain so that when I go back to work next, I'm ready to produce better work. Having fun with friends is about my PhD overall. And next slide, please. So there was a little bit of debate about what healthy behavior looked like when we talked to our students. Some saying that actually it felt like they needed permission to take breaks or to prioritize their well-being overall. And some students also identified that there were even physical problems, those who were in labs all day talking about pain in their back or in their legs, for instance. But actually recognizing as well that as they moved through that period of time, the more they took breaks, the more they looked after their physical self, the better that payoff was, both for their physical health and for their work overall. But then there is this challenge, I think, that research itself, setbacks are almost inevitable in research. And this can be challenging because you want it to be a straight line where you do this and do this and do this and you get your results and you write them up and there, presto, there we go. But that's never how research works. Certainly not in my experience. You're always coming up against the unexpected. So next slide, please. So why is it that we find this unsettling? Well, actually, human beings generally find uncertainty quite unsettling. If you think about why this might be, imagine you're out in the wild somewhere and you see something moving in the grassland. You don't know if that's a lion or the wind. So what our body system does is it just puts us onto hyper alert so that we're aware and we're ready just in case it's a predator out there. And that makes sense if you're needing to be aware that there's a predator out there, but you don't want to be in that state for very long because it's exhausting to be in that hyper aroused state. But it's also because we struggle around being uncertain around things that we think are important or relevant to us or that we're really focused on or where we feel we should be able to be certain. So we are really uncertain about who's going to win the Eurovision Song Contest next year. None of us know who that's going to be, but it's unlikely to cause any of us much stress because it's not important enough for that. And actually we manage uncertainty constantly on a day-to-day basis. We don't know what the weather's going to be like from day to day. And there are all kinds of things that we can't predict. And we just absorb and manage that. It's where we build an expectation that we should be able to be certain about something, that then becomes a problem. And one of the tricks about being able to kind of live with research and work within it is being able to go, it's unpredictable. I have no idea what's coming next. But whatever it is, I will learn from it. If I have a hypothesis and I put it in, I run an experiment and it's disproven, I've just learned something. That's not a failure. That's not my research not working. That's not a failure of the hypothesis. That's the way science works. You come up with an idea, you try it, you test it, you realize it didn't work, you learn from that, you build a new idea. And actually, if you can take that idea, we know that PhD students who view their research as a process, as opposed to viewing it as producing a perfect product, they have better well-being overall and generally do better on their PhD as well. So trying to see that research is just a messy process that you work your way through and produce findings out of, rather than that you're trying to produce a perfect product at the end of it. Next slide, please. And then the final thing is, again, is the things that can happen from outside. So I talked about this earlier, and we know that family and old networks, competing responsibilities, finances, all of these external things can impact on your well-being overall. Now, it's important that you are willing to access support services within your university if those things do happen. Many PhD students resist this. They think they should be able to manage without. There's all the shoulds come in again, almost this idea that if I need to access support services, I'm kind of admitting I'm not good enough to be a PhD student. That's simply not true. The support services are there to help you succeed on your research. They're there to help you succeed in your learning and in your work. So do be willing to go and access those services if these things are interfering, and to let your supervisor know. Talk to your supervisor about what's going on in your life. They know and understand that this is how it works. They will have had other students before. They'll have had colleagues who've done PhDs. They've done their own PhD themselves. They know that life intervenes and that you've got to make space to deal with all of that when it comes along. And if you lose a bit of ground now, you will pick it up again. Again, you've got 3 years overall. You don't have to be on it and be constantly productive in every moment. Next slide, please. Now, we should acknowledge, of course, that this is easier to say for some students than for others. That this does impact disproportionately on some students, and that very often the clock doesn't stop ticking just because things have impacted on your life. But it is important to not get yourself caught up in the fact that if you lose some days or some weeks, that you start thinking, actually, this means I'm going to fall behind, this means I'm not going to finish. If you think about it, every PhD student is going to lose days or weeks somewhere. Every student who ever got a PhD will have lost days and weeks somewhere, because over 3 years, you're inevitably going to get ill at some point. You're inevitably going to have some relationship difficulties. There might be some bereavements in your life. These things happen. It's inevitable that happens over the course of 3 years, and yet students still complete their PhDs and manage to be successful. So just because it happens, it doesn't mean it will prevent you from being successful. Next slide, please. So do be willing to go and use that support. And actually what you'll find is if you do use those resources, whether it's support services, the library staff, the study skills team, your supervisor, your colleagues and peers, it will make you a better researcher. It will lead to better research and means you can enjoy your time being a student much more. Next slide, please. So what you can do, don't buy into the myths. Don't buy into those narratives that tell you you have to give up your well-being. Take control of your own thoughts and behaviors, and then be part of that positive culture, because your behavior will then impact the environment around you as well. If you start taking breaks and talking about getting good sleep and leading a balanced lifestyle and still demonstrating you can get your research done, other people will look at that and adapt their practice and do that too. And then you'll be in a much healthier environment for everybody. And do be willing to use the support that's around you. And just as I finish then, we'll go through this quickly. Next slide then, please. Do take a look at the Wellbeing Thesis. It's just the wellbeingthesis.org.uk. On there, you will find a whole range of resources that have been co-created with students and with experts in the field and with PhD supervisors. Next slide, please. So you will hopefully find in there some language and some evidence to help you challenge your own thoughts and your own behaviors, but also those who are telling you should be giving up your well-being. There's some clear, simple tips to follow, some realistic, practical tips that you could follow as a PhD student. And some guidance on responding to those real life events and setbacks within the research process. So it's structured along the research journey overall. Next slide, please. And you will find in there some written guidance, but also some videos with students, some videos with experts, and some videos with supervisors, giving you guidance on how you can manage all of this together. Next slide, please. And then there are also some tools on there and some animations that you can use to help you. Next slide, please. And everything is, as you would expect, thoroughly referenced, so you can go away and check out the evidence for yourself and know that we're not talking nonsense. I hope all that's been really useful and helpful to you. I just need to get hopefully the question page back up again. And I hope it's been helpful. Please do take on board that idea that everything is connected, and we cannot separate out the our well-being and our ability to function and our ability to perform academically and to learn. So please do bear that in mind. Take the actions that you need to take, and good luck on your research journey overall. Thank you very much. So let me just take a look and see if we have any slides coming through. I can't actually see anything at the moment. Let me see if I can. How to overcome procrastination. Okay. So procrastination arises for a number of different reasons, and it really depends on what's driving your particular type of procrastination. So one of the key things about this is if you build a structure and a routine regularly so that you're working on a regular basis, then actually you get into a routine and the routine holds you. So habit is a really good way of overcoming procrastination. So procrastination kind of very often gets in the way when we aren't regularly engaging in activity, or getting yourself moving, just that first push is really the key thing. There are a number of tricks you can do for yourself. So sometimes what you might say to yourself is, right, I'm going to do 15 minutes work, and then if I'm still going, I'll keep going. But if I dry up after 15 minutes, well, at least I've done 15 minutes work. The other really important thing is to try and find meaning in what you're doing, so that you find something in there that passionately drives you and that you care about, because we're moved by our emotion. The word motion is an emotion because they're from the same root word. So if you can find an emotional connection to your work, a reason to be passionate about it and to care about it, then you're more likely to want to go and work on it. And the final thing is, one of the reasons we can procrastinate sometimes is because we can't figure out a way of doing things perfectly. So you can't figure out, how do I do this entire thing perfectly right at the very beginning? So breaking things down into much smaller steps can really help, but also saying to yourself, right, what I'm going to do now isn't going to be good. So particularly with writing, for instance, my first draft isn't going to be very good. Nobody else is going to see it. I'm going to write it for myself and it'll be rubbish, and that's fine. It's just a way of me getting my ideas down on paper, and then I can build on it and redraft and make it better after all of that. If you try to write perfectly right from the very beginning, then you'll just choke and nothing will happen whatsoever. So try and break things down into small steps. Give yourself the license to build your work up, and for the first bits not to be great and to make mistakes. Find the emotional connection, build a routine where you've got work, and then use those other things that we talked about earlier on. Exercise, healthy diet, good sleep will also make it easier to overcome that procrastination when it comes along. Oh, brilliant. Thank you. There we go. Okay. So how do you say no without feeling guilty? Yeah, it's worth asking where that guilt's coming from and why you think you should feel guilty, or why that guilt arises, and whether it's helpful to you. A really good question sometimes is just to say to yourself, how does this help me? So when you're experiencing an emotion or a thought, how is this thought actually helping me? And if it isn't, how can I actually then let go of it? One of the key things to think about is, if you think about, why are you there as a PhD student? You're there to learn, to develop the skills in order to be an independent researcher and to get your PhD overall. So if what you're being asked to do isn't going to contribute to that, there's no real need for you to feel guilty about it. If you are taking breaks, again, if you think of all the other thing to remember is, if you remember how human beings function, that we don't separate things off. So if you're asked to do something that's going to make you tired, that's going to wear you out, that's going to interrupt your sleep, or going to make you more stressed, then what you're actually agreeing to is giving up some of the work that you would otherwise have done on your PhD and on your own research project. And so thinking about, actually, is that helpful? So saying no to that extra work, if you don't have the capacity, actually all you're doing is protecting your research. All you're doing is protecting your ability to do good research and to contribute to getting towards your PhD overall. So thinking about, is that guilt actually yours? Is it coming from somebody else? Is it helpful in any way? And if it isn't, then being willing to let it go and to remind yourself that actually that you're doing this because this is what's going to help your project overall. PhDs can be an isolating experience because no one else is doing your project, no one else is doing your work. And so I understand completely the person's asking this question, how it can help to feel isolated. There's a number of ways to do this. One is to continue to have interests outside your PhD. Try not to make your PhD your whole life, because then your world shrinks into a small little bubble where you're kind of trapped on your own. Try and look outside of that. Continue to have other interests and other things that you can talk to other people about, because other people in your life may not get what you're talking about. They may not be that interested in it, and that's not because they don't care about you. It's just because they might not understand it or have your passion for it. So try and have other interests and other ways of engaging with other people. But then take that structured approach within your university. Build a plan and think, what are the things I'm interested in and that I care about? And that might include your research topic. Where might I find other people? So there may be research cafes, there may be a graduate society within the student union, or a mature student society, or whatever. And make a plan and go along to as many of those kinds of events as you possibly can and try to meet other people. Some of them you might go along to and not meet anybody that you like. That's just part of the process. Don't see that as a failure or something not working. That's part of the process. If you go to enough places, you will meet people who you like, and then that will gradually build some friendships, and then put that into the routine of your week. Have meeting other people be part of your PhD work. Make socializing be part of the structure of your week, so that that can support your brain, support your well-being, and thereby support your research overall. If you really have difficulty with perfectionism, I think one of the things is it's really important to remember that perfectionism is the enemy of creativity and research. Perfectionism gets in the way. And again, to think about Alexander Fleming and that discovery of penicillin, he set up a research experiment in his lab over the course of the week, set up Petri dishes in his lab over a weekend, came back and discovered he hadn't sealed them properly. And a bacteria had grown on his Petri dishes and had killed the cultures he was trying to grow. Now, if he'd been a perfectionist, he would have thrown them in the bin, gone and hidden his head under a pillow and thought, I'm a dreadful scientist, I should resign. But he didn't. What he did instead was he went, oh, that's really interesting. What's that? And in doing so, discovered penicillin and saved millions of lives. As researchers, that's our job. Our job is not to do things perfectly. It's to look at our mistakes and go, oh, can I learn from that? Oh, so what went wrong there? Why did it go wrong? And what can we take from that that's really helpful? Because we always need to approach the world with curiosity, not with a desire to be perfect. Now, if it's something you really struggle with, I would urge you to go and talk to support services. It is something you can overcome. It is something you can let go of, and there are great examples of people doing that. And it will free you up to make you a better researcher overall, that you can let go of being perfect and instead accept the messiness of research. But do be willing to access some support if you need to. And again, have that thought about, actually, is that perfectionist thought helpful? Or is it just trying to bully you into doing stuff that you know isn't useful and isn't helpful? In which case, see it as a kind of emotional arousal and do things to relax and get yourself calm, and then think through what it is you might be. Breathing techniques are real help with this. Whenever you get negative thoughts, negative emotions interfering in that way, actually breathing techniques can really help you reduce that emotional arousal, clear your brain, and then think about what is it I actually really want to do. In terms of improving your well-being in a budget, yeah, I mean, look, this is a real challenge, and I'm not going to pretend I've got miracle solutions. But I do think that a lot of the things that we want to do to improve our well-being actually don't have a huge cost, providing you're able to kind of feed yourself and you're living in reasonable accommodation and so on. And if you're not, then go and talk to your university, because there may well be funds that can help you with that, hardship funds and so on. But if you are able to kind of keep a roof over your head and have reasonably healthy food and so on, then actually a lot of the things that support your well-being, like exercise, don't require you joining a gym. Actually, exercise outside is more beneficial to your health than exercising in a gym. Being in nature, we know, improves our well-being overall. And if you spend 10 minutes a day being mindfully engaging with nature, that has a positive benefit. Spending time with friends, not necessarily going out and spending money, but just being in their presence and talking to them about what's going on in your life and having some fun. And that's really good for your well-being and doesn't necessarily need to cost an awful lot of money. Um, so a lot of the things that actually really benefit us, listening to music that you like, for instance, don't necessarily have to cost a huge amount. Um, Focusing down on what are those things that you actually need, what are the things you really need that are going to help your well-being overall. Student unions can be great places to look for all of that, for social connection, for kind of events that can help you with that. Chaplaincy can be really useful too if you have a kind of spiritual background or faith. Connecting to those kinds of things can be really good for your well-being overall. But also your research can be a source of good of benefit to your well-being. If you passionately care about your research, if you can find a way of getting emotional connection, so that the research itself, not getting the PhD, not getting the award, but the research itself feels meaningful to you, so that it feels like it has purpose. Actually doing the work then can have a really positive payoff to your mental health. And hard work isn't necessarily bad for us as long as it's within a balanced lifestyle. So your PhD itself can be good for your well-being overall. But if you are experiencing financial hardship, do talk to your university about that as well. So yeah, this is a really good question about feeling scared to draw lines about well-being with your supervisor as they're in a position of power over you. I think this is a really important one to look at about where you think that power actually exists and how much power there really is. Supervisors don't really have the option of just stopping supporting you, and they don't have the option of just getting rid of you, because there are all kinds of academic regulations in place to prevent that from happening. You can also ask for a change of supervisor. You're perfectly entitled to go to your university and go, you know what, this isn't working, I want to change supervisor. And don't forget, supervisors are also looked at for the number of PhD students that they get successfully through their PhD. So there is a pressure on them at the other end to make sure that this is happening. I think one of the key things for this is that actually for you to feel that this is not about you working for your supervisor. It's not your supervisor who dictates why this is. It's your PhD. But to think that your supervisor is a resource that's there to help you. Your university is providing you with your supervisor as a resource to support you. So you can have a big part to play in shaping how that resource works. So you can go and talk to your supervisor and go, you know what, I've been doing this for a while now, and I have worked out that for me, the best way to work is to do this. And feel free to use the evidence from this webinar or from the Wellbeing thesis to back you up on it, to say, and I've looked at the research, I've looked at the evidence, this is clearly what demonstrates how you do all of this. I will say I have known students who have done their PhDs working 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and that's the only work they did on it, and they got their PhD and they passed perfectly fine. So, being willing to push back on that, use the evidence, but just say, I've worked out, this is what works best for me, so this is how I'm going to do this. By protecting my well-being, I will produce better research. And actually what I need from you is this. And quite often, actually, supervisors are kind of quite pleased to kind of get that kind of feedback, because then they know what to do and how to help you out particularly. But thank you, that was a great question. We'll leave that as our last question. We'll make that the one that we finish off with. Thank you all. Those are really good questions. Thank you for your engagement. I hope this has been a really helpful webinar overall. I hope it's been useful. Do have a look at the Wellbeing thesis and check that out. And do check out the support services at your university. They are there for you as well. And support services and universities do great work, so do engage with them. Good luck with your research. I hope it all goes really well, and that out of all of the mess of the research, great ideas appear to you, new solutions occur to you, and that you're all successful in your journeys. It's been lovely to talk to you all today. Thank you very much, and good luck on your journey. Thank you.